This presentation is on energy in an ecosystem, so how energy moves through the organisms in an ecosystem. Make sure you're taking your notes in your binder, filling in all the blanks. Everything that gets filled in is underlined. There are some portions that I'd like for you to highlight, and those are going to be in a different color. Energy in an ecosystem. Living things use 90% of the energy that they take in for all life activities. So I talked about how organisms have to get energy and use that energy. So they're using energy to breathe, to move, to reproduce, to grow. All of those things take energy. And living things use about 90% of the energy that they get in order to do those things. The other 10% of the energy gets stored in the cells and the tissues. If an organism is eaten, that 10% that's in the cells and tissues is transferred from one organism to the organism that eats it. So that 10% that's in the cells and tissues, when those cells and tissues are then eaten by another organism, that organism gets that 10% that's stored there. Notice the word transferred is in a different color. Please highlight that in your notes. The energy pyramid is something that shows how much energy is transferred from one organism to the next when it's eaten. Since 10% is always passed on, we use a pyramid. The pyramid shows that the amount of energy that gets passed on is smaller and smaller and smaller. So from larger at the bottom, smaller up at the top. This is the energy pyramid for organisms in an ecosystem. We start with producers down at the bottom, then primary consumers, then secondary consumers, and up at the top we have tertiary consumers. Now, this pyramid can go up even further and further beyond tertiary consumers. You can have organisms that are considered to be the fourth consumer, which is quaternary consumer, and so on. But this pyramid gives us the basic idea. Now you can see on the left-hand side, it's showing how energy is going from high to low, and on the right-hand side, it's showing the population from large to small. So let's talk about the producers. The producers are at the base of the energy pyramid. These are the organisms that make their own food using sunlight. Producers have the most energy, which makes sense because they're getting their energy directly from the sun. So they have the most energy and they have a large population size. There are a ton of producers. Examples of producers are all different types of plants, grasses, flowers, even plants that are in the water. That's what we call algae. And there are actually some types of bacteria that produce their own energy. Remember, you're filling in the underlined words and then highlighting the ones that are in green. Primary consumers are the next level. They are organisms that feed on the producers. So we call primary consumers herbivores, which means they only eat producers. They only eat plants. So if you look at the way the energy pyramid flows, the primary consumers are feeding on the level below. Because of this, they have less energy than the producers. Remember, they only get 10% from eating a plant, which in turn makes them have a smaller population size. Some examples of primary consumers are insects, rabbits, deer, and more. These are all things that feed on plants. They're considered herbivores. Secondary consumers are the next level. They're organisms that feed on the primary consumers. Now, they're usually omnivores because they eat other animals, they eat the primary consumers, but sometimes they snack on producers. Sometimes they eat some carrots or some grass or some other plants as well. For the most part, though, they're feeding on the primary consumer below them. Because of this, they've got less energy. Remember, they're only getting 10% of the 10%. And they have a smaller population size. The reason the population size is getting smaller is because there's not enough energy that they're getting from the food. So they have to eat a lot more food since they only get a little sliver of energy. In order to have enough food for them to eat, there's got to be less secondary consumers and more primary consumers for them to munch on. Some examples of secondary consumers are frogs or foxes, bats, lizards and other small reptiles. They all are going to eat some of those primary consumers. Tertiary consumers. Tertiary consumers, they feed on the secondary consumers. They are carnivores because they are eating other animals. They're eating meat. They have the least energy on our pyramid because they only get the tiniest little bit, and they have the smallest population size. If you can imagine, if you had more crocodiles and hawks and tigers on Earth than we had plants, that wouldn't make for a balanced ecosystem. There's an analogy to help you understand how energy is moving through only 10% of the time. So imagine this is the amount of energy that a producer creates. There's 10 little bars of chocolate in here. When a primary consumer eats a producer, they only get the 10% that was stored. So you have 90% of the energy, so 9 of these chocolate squares get used up by the plant to grow and survive and reproduce. The 10% is stored, and when it's eaten, that's what the primary consumer gets, one little square. Now, out of that little square, the primary consumer uses up 90% of it and stores 10%. So when a secondary consumer then eats that primary consumer, they only get a little portion of that square. The secondary consumer uses 90% of that chocolate energy and stores 10% of it. So that when the tertiary consumer comes along and eats it, it gets that tiny little 10%. So here's what it looks like out of a 10-piece chocolate bar. The tertiary consumer is left with just this tiny little amount of energy. That's why there has to be enough secondary consumers for them to eat. And the secondary consumers need enough primary consumers to eat. And the primary consumers need enough producers to eat. Because if things were reversed, they wouldn't be able to survive with such little amounts of energy. They can't just eat one little animal, they've got to eat many in order to get enough energy to survive. Now, as always, make sure that if you have any questions, you come see me.